I was 62 years old when I walked into that sterile medical office in downtown Chicago, clutching my insurance card with trembling fingers. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher than usual that Tuesday morning, casting an unforgiving glow over everything. I had been struggling with my weight for decades, and after my doctor's latest warnings about diabetes and high blood pressure, I finally mustered the courage to seek help from a nutritionist. What I didn't expect was to encounter the most humiliating experience of my adult life. The waiting room was filled with thin, young people flipping through fitness magazines. I felt their eyes on me as I squeezed into one of those plastic chairs that seemed designed for anyone but someone my size. My thighs spilled over the sides, and I could hear the chair creaking under my weight. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for my name to be called, trying to ignore the judgmental stares and whispered comments from other patients. When Margaret Thompson finally echoed through the room, I stood up with difficulty, my knees protesting after sitting in that uncomfortable position. The walk to the consultation room felt like a mile. The nutritionist, a woman in her 30s with a perfect figure and an expensive suit, looked me up and down with obvious disgust. She didn't even attempt to hide her disdain as she gestured for me to sit in another undersized chair. "So, Mrs. Thompson," she began, not even looking at my file, "what brings you here today? Let me guess, you want a magic solution to decades of poor choices?" Her tone was condescending, and I could already feel my cheeks burning with embarrassment. But what came next would haunt me for months. As I tried to explain my health concerns and genuine desire to improve my lifestyle, she interrupted me with a dismissive wave. "Listen, honey, let's be honest here. You're just a lazy, fat old woman who's looking for someone else to blame for your problems." The words hit me like physical blows. I saw the nurses behind her exchange glances and suppress giggles. One even covered her mouth, trying to hide her laughter. The room fell silent except for the humming of the air conditioning. I felt my face flush red, not from embarrassment, but from a rage I had never experienced before. In that moment, sitting in that cramped chair, being ridiculed by someone half my age who was supposed to help me, something fundamental shifted inside me. I realized that this wasn't about my weight. This was about basic human dignity, respect, and the right to be treated as a person worthy of compassion. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking, not from the effort, but from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Thank you for showing me exactly what I needed to see today," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You've just given me more motivation than you could ever imagine." I walked out of that office with my head held high. But inside, I was planning something that would change not just my life, but the lives of thousands of other women like me. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my reflection in the dark window and made a promise to myself that would reshape everything I thought I knew about strength, determination, and the power of a woman who refuses to be diminished by anyone else's ignorance. If this story of a courageous plus-size woman has already moved you, hit the like button now so more people can watch this video. Before that life-altering moment in the nutritionist's office, I was Margaret Thompson, a retired high school English teacher from the south side of Chicago. For 40 years, I had dedicated my life to educating teenagers, many of whom came from challenging backgrounds. I believed in the power of words, the importance of treating every student with dignity, and the transformative nature of education. Ironically, it was these very principles that would later guide my journey toward empowerment. I had been married to Robert for 38 years when he passed away from a heart attack 3 years prior to that humiliating medical appointment. Robert had loved me unconditionally, never once making me feel ashamed of my body or my size. He would often say, "Maggie, you're the most beautiful woman in the world to me, and that's all that matters." His death left a void in my life that I tried to fill with food, making my weight situation even more challenging. My daily routine was simple and predictable. I lived in a small 2-bedroom house in Bronzeville, a neighborhood rich in African-American history and culture. Every morning, I would wake up at 6, make my coffee, and sit on my front porch, watching the neighborhood come alive. The local kids would wave at me on their way to school, calling out, "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," just like they had when I was their teacher. I had always been what society considered overweight, but it wasn't until my 50s that my weight became what doctors labeled as severely obese. The pounds had accumulated gradually over the years, through pregnancies that ended in miscarriages, the stress of teaching in underfunded schools, the emotional eating that followed my husband's death, and the natural slowing of metabolism that comes with age. Despite my size, I had always been active in my community. I volunteered at the local library, helping adults learn to read. I organized food drives for families in need and participated in voter registration campaigns. My weight never prevented me from living my life fully, but it did make certain everyday activities more challenging. Simple things like climbing stairs, finding clothes that fit properly, or sitting comfortably in restaurant booths became sources of frustration. My relationship with healthcare had always been complicated. Every doctor's visit seemed to focus exclusively on my weight rather than addressing my actual concerns. Blood pressure medications were prescribed with lectures about diet and exercise. Knee pain was dismissed as a simple consequence of being too heavy. I had grown accustomed to being treated as a problem to be solved, rather than a person deserving of comprehensive care. The financial stress of living on a teacher's pension while managing increasing medical expenses added another layer of complexity to my life. I couldn't afford gym memberships, personal trainers, or expensive diet programs. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very people who judged me for my weight often had access to resources I could only dream of. The words "lazy fat old woman" echoed in my mind. For days after leaving that nutritionist's office, I found myself replaying the scene over and over, each time feeling the sting of humiliation more deeply. Sleep became elusive as I tossed and turned, alternating between rage and despair. The laughter of those nurses haunted me, their faces appearing in my dreams like cruel specters, mocking my pain. For the first few days, I barely ate anything, which was ironic given the circumstances. My appetite vanished, replaced by a knot in my stomach that seemed to tighten every time I remembered the incident. I found myself crying at unexpected moments, while watching television, during my morning coffee, or simply looking at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The tears weren't just about the words themselves, but about the lifetime of similar experiences they represented. I began to question everything about myself. Was I really just lazy? Had I brought this treatment upon myself? The self-doubt crept in like poison, making me second-guess every decision I had made about my health and my life. I started avoiding my usual walks around the neighborhood, afraid of encountering neighbors who might judge me the way that nutritionist had. The front porch where I used to enjoy my morning coffee became a place I avoided, fearful of curious stares. The isolation was perhaps the most painful part. I found myself declining invitations to church functions and community meetings. When my sister called to check on me, I made excuses to keep our conversations short. The shame felt overwhelming, as if everyone could somehow see the humiliation written across my face. I began to withdraw from the very activities and relationships that had always given my life meaning and purpose. But beneath the hurt and embarrassment, something else was growing, a slow-burning anger that refused to be extinguished. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the neighborhood was asleep, I would pace my living room, replaying not just that day's events, but years of similar treatments. The anger wasn't destructive. It was clarifying. It helped me see that what happened in that office wasn't really about me. It was about a system that dehumanizes people based on their appearance. The emotional impact extended beyond my personal feelings. I began to think about all the other women who had probably sat in similar chairs, enduring similar humiliations. I thought about the young girls who might grow up believing that their worth was determined by the number on a scale. The teacher in me recognized an opportunity for education and change, even if I couldn't yet see exactly what form that change would take. This period of emotional processing was crucial to my transformation. It forced me to confront not just the incident itself, but my own internalized beliefs about weight, worth, and dignity. I realized that I had been unconsciously accepting society's judgments about my body, and that acceptance had been slowly eroding my self-respect for years. As I sat in my living room that week, the nutritionist's cruel words triggered a flood of similar memories that I had buried deep in my mind. Each recollection felt like reopening an old wound, but I realized that confronting these experiences was essential to understanding how I had arrived at this point in my life. I remembered being 12 years old, shopping for a dress for my middle school graduation with my mother. We had visited 5 different stores, and in each one, the salespeople would look at me with barely concealed disdain before informing us that they didn't carry sizes that large. My mother, bless her heart, tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the hurt in her eyes as she watched her daughter being rejected by store after store. That day, I learned that my body was something to be ashamed of, something that made other people uncomfortable. High school brought its own set of humiliations. During physical education classes, I was always the last one chosen for teams. The gym uniforms never fit properly, and I would spend the entire class period tugging at the too tight shorts and oversized shirt, trying to cover my body while participating in activities that left me breathless and sweating more than my classmates. The other students weren't necessarily cruel, but their casual exclusion and uncomfortable glances spoke volumes about how they viewed me. College was supposed to be a fresh start, but the dormitory experience proved challenging. The twin beds were narrow, the desk chairs were uncomfortable, and the communal showers felt like daily exercises in humiliation. I quickly learned to shower at odd hours to avoid the stares and whispered comments of my roommates. Dating was virtually non-existent, as I had internalized the message that someone my size wasn't deserving of romantic attention. Even my teaching career, which brought me so much joy and fulfillment, had its painful moments. Parent-teacher conferences sometimes included subtle comments about my appearance. I overheard students making jokes about my size, though they were usually mortified when they realized I had heard them. School furniture was universally uncomfortable, and faculty meetings in cramped classrooms became exercises in endurance. Medical appointments had been consistently frustrating for decades. Doctors would glance at my chart, see my weight, and immediately launch into lectures about diet and exercise without addressing my actual concerns. When I complained of knee pain, it was dismissed as a weight issue. When I mentioned fatigue, I was told to lose weight. Every symptom, every concern, every health issue was reduced to a single factor: my size. Air travel was particularly humiliating. The embarrassment of asking for a seatbelt extender, the discomfort of squeezing into seats designed for much smaller bodies, and the resentful looks from fellow passengers who were inconvenienced by my presence created anxiety around any trip that required flying. I eventually stopped traveling altogether, using my size as an excuse to decline invitations and opportunities. Shopping for clothes had always been a source of stress and disappointment. The limited options in plus-size sections, the higher prices for larger sizes, and the assumption that larger women only wanted to hide their bodies in shapeless, colorless garments had made getting dressed a daily reminder of my supposed inadequacy. Restaurant experiences brought their own challenges. Booths were often too narrow, chairs sometimes broke under my weight, and servers would sometimes make assumptions about my food choices that were both embarrassing and incorrect. I learned to scope out restaurants before agreeing to meet friends, ensuring that I could sit comfortably without drawing unwanted attention. 3 weeks after the nutritionist incident, I found myself sitting in my late husband's favorite chair, surrounded by photo albums that I hadn't opened since his funeral. Something about that humiliating experience had awakened a need to reconnect with who I used to be, before years of societal judgment had worn down my spirit. As I flipped through pictures of Robert and me at various stages of our marriage, I saw something that shocked me: happiness. In photo after photo, despite my varying weights over the years, I looked genuinely joyful. There I was, laughing at our wedding reception, my dress size irrelevant to the pure joy radiating from my face. There we were on vacation in Florida, me in a bathing suit without a trace of shame, building sandcastles with neighborhood children who had joined our beach fun. Picture after picture showed a woman who was living fully, loving deeply, and contributing meaningfully to her community. When had I stopped being that woman? When had I started believing that my worth was determined by a number on a scale, rather than the lives I had touched, the students I had inspired, or the love I had shared with my husband? The woman in those photographs wouldn't have tolerated being called a lazy fat old woman. She would have recognized it as the ignorant prejudice it was and responded accordingly. I realized that the nutritionist's cruelty wasn't really about me at all. It was about her own biases, her lack of professionalism, and her inability to see beyond appearance to the human being sitting in front of her. I had allowed her limited perspective to validate insecurities I had been carrying for years. But looking at these photos reminded me that her opinion was just that, one person's narrow-minded judgment. That night, I made a list of everything I had accomplished in my 62 years of life. The list was longer than I expected. 40 years of teaching, hundreds of students whose lives I had impacted, community service projects, the loving marriage I had maintained, the friendships I had cultivated, and the strength I had shown in rebuilding my life after Robert's death. None of these accomplishments had anything to do with my dress size. I also made a list of all the ways I had been discriminated against because of my weight, and I was shocked by its length. From the subtle exclusions to the outright cruelty, I had endured decades of prejudice that I had somehow learned to accept as normal. But seeing it all written down, I realized that none of it had been acceptable. I had been complicit in my own dehumanization by accepting treatment that I would never have tolerated if it had been based on any other characteristic. The reflection period also helped me understand that I wasn't alone in this experience. Every plus-size woman I knew had similar stories, similar hurts, similar moments of being made to feel less than human because of their appearance. We had all learned to shrink ourselves, not just physically, but emotionally and socially, to accommodate a world that seemed designed to exclude us. This realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating, because I finally understood the full scope of the discrimination I had endured and internalized. Liberating, because I recognized that the problem wasn't me. It was a system of prejudice that needed to be challenged. The morning I decided to fight back was unseasonably warm for October in Chicago. I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, as if the fog of self-doubt and shame had finally lifted. I sat at my kitchen table with my morning coffee, looking out at the changing leaves, and made a decision that would alter the trajectory of my life. I was going to become the advocate for plus-size women that I wished had existed when I needed one most. My first step was research. I spent hours on my computer learning about size discrimination, body positivity movements, and the experiences of other women who had faced similar challenges. What I discovered was both heartbreaking and empowering. There were thousands of women sharing stories identical to mine, but there were also women who were fighting back, creating change, and refusing to accept discriminatory treatment. I learned about the Health at Every Size movement, which challenged the assumption that health could be determined by appearance alone. I discovered plus-size activists who were demanding better treatment in medical settings, equal access to public accommodations, and an end to weight-based discrimination in employment and other areas of life. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel alone. The teacher in me immediately began formulating a plan. If I was going to make a difference, I needed to educate myself thoroughly and develop a strategy that would create real, lasting change. I started by documenting my own experiences, writing detailed accounts of every discriminatory incident I could remember. The process was painful but necessary. I needed to understand the full scope of the problem before I could begin to address it. I also began reaching out to other women in my community, carefully bringing up the topic of weight discrimination in conversations with friends, neighbors, and former colleagues. What I discovered was shocking. Virtually every plus-size woman I knew had similar stories, but most had never spoken about them openly. There was a conspiracy of silence around size discrimination that kept women isolated and ashamed. My first concrete action was to file a complaint with the medical board about the nutritionist's unprofessional behavior. I spent hours crafting a detailed letter describing not just the incident itself, but its impact on my health and well-being. I researched the ethical standards that medical professionals are supposed to uphold and demonstrated how her behavior had violated multiple principles of patient care. The process of filing that complaint was terrifying and empowering in equal measure. I had never challenged a medical professional before, and part of me worried that I was overreacting or making trouble. But I remembered the nurses laughing, and I thought about all the other women who might sit in that same chair and endure similar treatment. I realized that staying silent wasn't protecting anyone. It was perpetuating a system that dehumanized people based on their appearance. I also started a journal, documenting my daily experiences with size discrimination and the steps I was taking to address them. This practice helped me recognize patterns I had previously overlooked and gave me concrete examples to use in my advocacy work. Every snide comment, every too small chair, every judgmental look became data points in my growing understanding of systematic prejudice. And you, plus-size woman who is watching, have you been through something similar? Tell us in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more empowerment stories. The response to my medical board complaint surprised me. Within 2 weeks, I received a call from an investigator who wanted to interview me about my experience. During that phone conversation, which lasted over an hour, I found myself speaking with a confidence and authority that I hadn't accessed in years. The investigator was professional, respectful, and clearly took my complaint seriously. For the first time in decades, a healthcare-related professional was treating me like a credible witness rather than a problem to be dismissed. That phone call awakened something in me that I hadn't felt since my teaching days, the power of my own voice. As I described the incident in detail, providing specific quotes and describing the impact on my emotional and physical health, I realized that I was an excellent advocate for myself and potentially for others. My years in education had taught me how to present information clearly, how to build compelling arguments, and how to speak with authority on subjects I understood well. I began to recognize strength in experiences I had previously viewed as weaknesses or failures. My decades of navigating size discrimination had given me expertise that couldn't be learned from textbooks or training programs. I understood the psychological impact of weight-based prejudice because I had lived it. I knew how discrimination affected healthcare access because I had experienced it firsthand. I was uniquely qualified to speak on these issues because I had survived them. The teacher in me started to emerge more strongly as I realized that education was the key to changing attitudes about size and weight. Most people who engaged in discriminatory behavior weren't necessarily evil, they were ignorant. They had absorbed societal messages about weight and health without questioning them. They needed to be educated about the complexity of weight, the ineffectiveness of shame as a motivator, and the basic principles of human dignity. I started attending city council meetings, initially just to observe and learn about the political process. But as I listened to various community concerns being raised, I began to see opportunities to address size discrimination at a policy level. I researched municipal anti-discrimination ordinances and discovered that many cities had expanded their civil rights protections to include weight and appearance-based discrimination. Confidence grew as I began engaging in online communities focused on size acceptance and body positivity. These spaces allowed me to share my experiences and learn from women of all ages who were challenging weight-based discrimination. I found myself becoming a voice of wisdom and experience for younger women who were just beginning to recognize and confront prejudice in their own lives. The investigator from the medical board called me back 3 weeks later with an update that filled me with pride and vindication. The nutritionist had been formally reprimanded and was required to complete training on cultural sensitivity and professional ethics. Moreover, the clinic had implemented new policies regarding respectful patient interaction. My complaint had created real change that would benefit other patients in the future. This victory, modest as it might seem, proved to me that speaking up could make a difference. One woman's refusal to accept discriminatory treatment had resulted in institutional policy changes that would protect others. I began to understand that my individual experience was part of a larger pattern that could only be disrupted through collective action and sustained advocacy. Emboldened by the success of my medical board complaint, I began looking for other opportunities to challenge discriminatory treatment in my daily life. The first test came sooner than I expected, during what should have been a routine shopping trip to a popular department store in downtown Chicago. I was looking for a dress to wear to my niece's wedding, and the experience would become a pivotal moment in my journey towards self-advocacy. The plus-size section, tucked away in a corner of the store like an afterthought, contained maybe 20 garments in drab colors and unflattering styles. When I asked a saleswoman if there were other options, she gave me a look that I had seen countless times before, a mixture of impatience and barely concealed disdain. "This is what we have in your size," she said dismissively, gesturing toward the meager selection. The old me would have accepted this treatment, made an excuse about coming back later, and left the store feeling embarrassed and frustrated. But the new me, armed with knowledge about consumer rights and strengthened by recent advocacy experience, responded differently. "I'd like to speak with the manager, please," I said calmly but firmly. The manager, a middle-aged woman who seemed genuinely concerned about customer service, listened as I explained that the store's plus-size selection was inadequate and that the sales staff seemed undertrained in helping customers of all sizes. I didn't raise my voice or make accusations, but I clearly articulated my concerns and asked what the store planned to do to better serve plus-size customers. What happened next surprised both of us. The manager admitted that she had received similar complaints before, but hadn't known how to address them effectively. She asked if I would be willing to provide feedback on the store's plus-size offerings and suggestions for improvement. I agreed, and she took down my contact information, promising to follow up within a week. That conversation led to my first consulting opportunity. The store hired me as a part-time advisor on plus-size retail, helping them expand their selection, train their staff on inclusive customer service, and redesign the plus-size section to be more welcoming and accessible. I was being paid for my expertise in an area where I had previously only experienced discrimination. My success with the department store gave me confidence to address other situations where I had previously remained silent. When my doctor's office called to schedule my annual physical, I was prepared with specific requests. I asked for a longer appointment time, requested that the discussion focus on my overall health rather than just my weight, and specified that I wanted to be treated with the same respect afforded to all patients. The appointment went better than any medical visit I had experienced in years. My new approach, calm, specific, and professional, seemed to command respect in a way that my previous passive acceptance never had. The doctor actually listened to my concerns about joint pain and fatigue, ordered appropriate tests, and developed a comprehensive health plan that addressed my actual symptoms rather than just my appearance. I began applying this advocacy approach to other areas of my life. When a restaurant hostess tried to seat me at a cramped table near the kitchen, I politely asked for a more comfortable seating option. When an airline gate agent made assumptions about my need for wheelchair assistance, I clarified my actual needs and preferences. In each situation, I approached the interaction as an opportunity for education rather than confrontation. My growing reputation as a size acceptance advocate brought opportunities I had never imagined. But it also brought new challenges that tested my resolve and forced me to grow in ways I hadn't anticipated. The local chapter of the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance reached out to me after hearing about my work with the department store, inviting me to speak at their monthly meeting about my experiences with medical discrimination. Standing in front of that room, full of women and men who had faced similar struggles, was both intimidating and empowering. As I shared my story about the nutritionist's cruel comment and the journey it had sparked, I saw recognition and hope in their faces. But I also saw pain that mirrored my own, decades of accumulated hurt that wouldn't be easily healed by one person's advocacy efforts. After my presentation, a young woman in her 20s approached me with tears in her eyes. She told me that she had been avoiding medical care for years because of experiences similar to mine, and that her health was deteriorating as a result. In that moment, I realized that my advocacy work wasn't just about changing systems, it was about saving lives. The weight of that responsibility was both inspiring and terrifying. The media attention that followed my speaking engagement brought unexpected challenges. A local news station wanted to interview me about size discrimination in healthcare, which seemed like a wonderful opportunity to educate the public. But the interview process revealed biases even among people who thought they were being supportive. The reporter repeatedly asked about my weight loss efforts, unable to understand that my advocacy wasn't about changing my body, but about changing society's response to it. The news segment, when it aired, was edited in a way that emphasized my size rather than my message. The camera angles were unflattering, and the story was framed as a feel-good piece about an overweight woman learning to love herself, rather than a serious examination of systemic discrimination. I realized that even well-intentioned media coverage could perpetuate the very stereotypes I was trying to challenge. Online harassment became an unexpected part of my advocacy work. As my story spread through social media, I began receiving cruel comments and messages from strangers who felt entitled to judge my body and my choices. The anonymity of the internet seemed to bring out the worst in people, and I had to develop thick skin quickly to continue my work without being derailed by cruelty. But perhaps the most difficult challenge came from within my own community. Some family members and longtime friends struggled to understand my transformation from quiet acceptance to vocal advocacy. They worried that I was making trouble, drawing unwanted attention, or embarrassing myself in them. A few suggested that I would be happier if I just focused on losing weight, rather than fighting discrimination. These responses from people I loved forced me to confront the deep-seated nature of weight bias in our society. Even people who cared about me had internalized messages that made them uncomfortable with my refusal to accept discriminatory treatment. I realized that changing minds would be a longer and more complex process than I had initially understood. The challenges also included practical considerations I hadn't anticipated. Advocacy work was time-consuming and emotionally draining. I was spending hours researching issues, responding to emails, and preparing for speaking engagements, all while living on a fixed retirement income. I had to learn to set boundaries and prioritize my efforts to avoid burnout while still making meaningful progress. The process of advocating for others forced me to confront my own internalized weight bias and begin the difficult work of rebuilding my self-esteem from the ground up. Every time I stood up for another plus-size woman or challenged discriminatory policies, I was also standing up for myself and affirming my own worth. This parallel process of external advocacy and internal healing became the foundation of my personal transformation. I started by changing my inner dialogue, catching myself every time I used negative self-talk about my body or my appearance. The voice in my head that had been saying, "You're too fat," or "You don't belong here," was gradually replaced with more compassionate and realistic self-assessment. Instead of focusing on what my body couldn't do, I began appreciating what it had accomplished, carrying me through 40 years of teaching, surviving the loss of my husband, and giving me the strength to fight for justice. One of my first concrete steps toward building self-esteem was updating my wardrobe. For years, I had been buying clothes that were designed to hide my body rather than celebrate it. I began investing in well-fitting garments in colors and styles that made me feel confident and attractive. This wasn't about conforming to beauty standards, but about presenting myself in a way that reflected my inner strength and self-respect. I also started taking better care of my physical health, not for weight loss, but for overall well-being. I found a physician who practiced health at every size principles and focused on helping me manage my blood pressure and joint pain without making weight loss the primary goal. Regular walks in my neighborhood became a form of moving meditation rather than punishment. For my body's appearance, the work of rebuilding self-esteem required me to reconnect with activities and interests that brought me joy. I had been avoiding many social situations because of my size, but I gradually began participating in community events, church activities, and social gatherings with friends. Each positive interaction helped reinforce the message that my worth wasn't determined by my appearance. I started a gratitude practice, writing down 3 things I was thankful for each day. Many of these entries focused on what my body allowed me to do: hug my grandchildren, prepare meals for friends, walk in my garden, or speak at advocacy events. This practice helped shift my focus from what I perceived as physical inadequacies to the many ways my body served me and others. Photography became an unexpected tool in my self-esteem journey. I had been avoiding cameras for years, but I began asking friends and family to take pictures of me at advocacy events and social gatherings. Seeing myself in photographs where I looked happy, confident, and engaged helped me recognize that my self-perception had been distorted by years of negative messaging. The advocacy work itself was profoundly healing. Every time I helped another plus-size woman navigate discrimination or successfully challenged unfair treatment, I was proving to myself that I had value and power. The skills I had developed as a teacher, patience, empathy, clear communication, and the ability to see potential in others, were perfectly suited to advocacy work. I began surrounding myself with people who shared my values and supported my advocacy efforts. This meant limiting time with individuals who made disparaging comments about weight or appearance, and seeking out communities of like-minded people who understood the importance of size acceptance. Having a supportive network made it easier to maintain my self-esteem when facing external criticism or challenges. My advocacy work had shown me the scope of size discrimination, but I realized that identifying problems wasn't enough. I needed to develop concrete solutions that could create lasting change. Drawing on my background in education, I began developing workshops and training programs that could help organizations become more inclusive and respectful toward people of all sizes. The first workshop I created focused on healthcare settings, addressing the specific challenges that plus-size patients face and providing practical strategies for medical professionals to improve their care. I partnered with a local medical school to pilot the program, and the response from both students and faculty exceeded my expectations. Many healthcare providers genuinely wanted to provide better care, but simply hadn't understood how their biases affected their patients. The workshop covered topics like appropriate language when discussing weight, the importance of having properly sized medical equipment, and the recognition that health and weight are complex and individual matters. I shared my own story and invited other plus-size patients to discuss their experiences, giving medical students a personal perspective on the impact of their words and actions. One of my most significant innovations was creating a resource guide for plus-size individuals navigating healthcare settings. The guide included tips for preparing for medical appointments, questions to ask healthcare providers, and strategies for advocating for respectful treatment. I distributed these guides through community organizations, libraries, and online platforms, reaching hundreds of people who had never considered that they had the right to demand better treatment. I also began working with local businesses to improve their accessibility and inclusivity. This involved everything from ensuring that restaurants had appropriate seating options to helping retailers expand their plus-size selections and train staff on respectful customer service. Each successful partnership created a model that could be replicated in other businesses and communities. The legal aspect of size discrimination became another area where I developed expertise and solutions. I researched municipal anti-discrimination ordinances and worked with city council members to explore expanding civil rights protections to include weight and appearance-based discrimination. This was groundbreaking work that required extensive research and coalition building with other advocacy organizations. Technology became an unexpected ally in my solution development. I created an online platform where plus-size individuals could share their experiences with discrimination and rate businesses and healthcare providers based on their inclusivity. This crowdsourced approach provided valuable information to community members while also giving businesses incentives to improve their practices. My educational background proved invaluable in developing age-appropriate materials for young people. I created presentations for middle and high schools about body diversity, self-acceptance, and the dangers of weight-based bullying. Working with younger people was particularly rewarding because I could see how different their attitudes were when they received accurate information about weight and health from the beginning. The solutions I developed were always practical and implementable. I understood that lasting change required making it easy for people and organizations to do better. Whether it was providing specific scripts for respectful patient interaction or creating simple checklists for business accessibility, I focused on tools that could be used immediately and effectively. If you believe that obese women can achieve anything, subscribe to the channel and share this video with a friend who needs to be empowered. 6 months into my advocacy work, The results began to manifest in ways that validated my efforts and inspired me to continue. The department store where I had first practiced my advocacy skills had not only expanded their plus-size section, but had also become a model for other locations in the chain. Their corporate headquarters reached out to me to help develop company-wide policies for inclusive retail practices. The medical school where I had piloted my healthcare workshop requested that I make it part of their regular curriculum. The dean personally called to tell me that student evaluations had been overwhelmingly positive, with many noting that the session had fundamentally changed their understanding of patient care and bias in medicine. More importantly, I began receiving emails and phone calls from individuals who had heard about my work and wanted to share their own success stories. A woman named Patricia told me that after attending one of my workshops, she had finally found the courage to switch doctors and was now receiving the respectful health care she deserved. Another woman, Susan, used the business advocacy strategies I had taught to successfully negotiate better accommodations at her workplace. The ripple effects of my work were becoming visible throughout the community. The city council member I had been working with introduced a proposal to expand the city's anti-discrimination ordinance to include weight and appearance-based discrimination. While the proposal was still in committee, the fact that it was being seriously considered represented a significant step forward for civil rights in our community. My online platform for rating businesses, based on size inclusivity, had grown to include over 200 reviews and was being used by plus-size individuals throughout the Chicago metropolitan area. Several businesses had reached out to me directly after receiving poor ratings, asking for guidance on how to improve their practices. This voluntary engagement with the business community was more effective than I had ever imagined it could be. The healthcare resource guide I had created was being distributed by 3 different community health organizations and had been translated into Spanish to reach a broader population. A local hospital system had requested permission to include excerpts from the guide in their patient information packets, acknowledging that they needed to do better in serving plus-size patients. Media coverage of my work had improved significantly as I learned to better control the narrative and work with journalists who were genuinely interested in addressing discrimination rather than sensationalizing my personal story. A feature article in the Chicago Tribune focused on the policy changes I was advocating for rather than my personal weight, and the response from readers was largely supportive. The financial aspects of my advocacy work had also begun to stabilize. The consulting fees from businesses and healthcare organizations were supplementing my retirement income, allowing me to dedicate more time to unpaid advocacy work without financial stress. I was being compensated for my expertise rather than being seen as a charity case, which reinforced my sense of professional competence and value. Perhaps most significantly, I was seeing changes in myself that went beyond external achievements. I walked with more confidence, spoke with greater authority, and approached challenges with a problem-solving mindset rather than resignation. The woman who had once accepted cruel treatment as inevitable had been replaced by someone who expected respect and was willing to work for systemic change. The success of my efforts had attracted the attention of state-level advocacy organizations, and I was invited to speak at a statewide conference on civil rights and discrimination. Standing on that stage, addressing an audience of legislators, activists, and community leaders, I marveled at how far I had come from that humiliating day in the nutritionist's office. The most rewarding aspect of my advocacy work became the relationships I developed with other women who were inspired to begin their own journeys toward empowerment. My story seemed to give them permission to challenge treatment they had long accepted as normal, and watching their transformations was incredibly fulfilling. Maria, a 45-year-old nurse who attended one of my healthcare workshops, approached me afterward with tears in her eyes. She confided that she had been experiencing discrimination from colleagues and had been considering leaving the profession she loved. After our conversation, she decided to file a complaint with her hospital's Human Resources Department and request training for her unit on weight bias in healthcare settings. 3 months later, Maria called to tell me that her complaint had resulted in mandatory bias training for all staff members and new policies protecting employees from appearance-based discrimination. She had not only kept her job, but had been promoted to a position where she could influence patient care policies. Her success inspired several other healthcare workers to reach out to me for guidance in addressing similar situations. A group of women who had attended my workshops formed their own advocacy group. Calling themselves Women of Substance, they began meeting monthly to share experiences, support each other's advocacy efforts, and plan community actions. Watching them organize and take action independently was proof that my work was creating sustainable change that would continue beyond my individual efforts. The online community that had grown around my platform became a source of mutual support and shared activism. Women from across the country were sharing strategies for addressing discrimination, celebrating each other's victories, and providing encouragement during difficult times. The isolation that so many plus-size women experienced was being replaced by connection and collective action. I began receiving invitations to speak at conferences and events in other cities, spreading the message of size acceptance and anti-discrimination advocacy to new audiences. Each speaking engagement introduced me to local advocates who were doing similar work in their communities, creating a network of activists who could support and learn from each other. Young women, in particular, seemed to connect with my message of refusing to accept discriminatory treatment. A college student named Jennifer reached out after seeing me speak at her university, sharing that my presentation had helped her recognize that the treatment she was receiving from professors and classmates was not acceptable. She began documenting incidents of size-based discrimination on her campus and eventually presented her findings to the administration, resulting in new policies and awareness training. The intergenerational aspect of my advocacy work was particularly meaningful. As a woman in my 60s, I could provide perspective and wisdom to younger advocates while learning from their energy and innovative approaches to activism. The combination of my life experience and their technological savvy created powerful partnerships for change. Parents of plus-size children began reaching out for guidance on how to protect their kids from discrimination and build their self-esteem. I developed resources specifically for families, helping parents understand how to advocate for their children in schools and healthcare settings while building resilience against societal prejudice. The teacher in me was deeply satisfied by the educational aspect of this work. I was seeing people unlearn harmful beliefs about weight and health, develop critical thinking skills about media messages and social norms, and gain confidence in their ability to create positive change. These were the same satisfaction I had experienced in the classroom, but with the added dimension of addressing systemic injustice. 2 years into my advocacy work, opportunities began presenting themselves that I could never have imagined when I walked out of that nutritionist's office. The National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance invited me to serve on their board of directors, recognizing my contributions to policy advocacy and community organizing. This position gave me a platform to influence national conversations about size discrimination and civil rights. My work caught the attention of researchers studying weight bias in healthcare, and I was invited to participate in a multi-site study examining patient experiences and outcomes. Contributing to academic research felt like a natural extension of my educational background, and I was excited to help generate evidence that could support policy changes and professional training programs. A publisher approached me about writing a book that would combine my personal story with practical guidance for other advocates. The idea of reaching a national audience with my message was thrilling, but it also felt overwhelming. I had never considered myself a writer, despite my English teaching background. However, my advocacy work had given me confidence to take on new challenges, and I agreed to explore the possibility. The book project forced me to reflect deeply on my journey and articulate the lessons I had learned in a way that could benefit others. Writing about my experiences was both cathartic and challenging, requiring me to revisit painful memories while also celebrating the growth and change that had resulted from them. The process helped me understand my own transformation more clearly and identify the key strategies that had been most effective. Television producers began reaching out, interested in featuring my story in documentaries about body acceptance and civil rights. While I was initially hesitant about the media attention, I realized that television could reach audiences that my workshops and speaking engagements couldn't access. I agreed to participate in a documentary that focused on the broader movement for size acceptance rather than just my individual story. Corporate consulting became a significant part of my work as companies began to recognize the business case for size inclusivity. I helped organizations understand that plus-size customers and employees represented a significant market segment that was often underserved or excluded entirely. My consulting work included everything from product development to marketing strategies to workplace policies. The legal advocacy aspect of my work expanded when I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee examining discrimination in healthcare. Standing in that committee room, sharing my story with elected officials who had the power to create national policy changes, was both intimidating and empowering. My testimony contributed to proposed legislation that would strengthen civil rights protections for individuals facing weight-based discrimination. International opportunities emerged as advocates in other countries learned about my work. I was invited to speak at conferences in Canada and the United Kingdom, where I discovered that size discrimination was a global issue requiring coordinated advocacy efforts. These international connections broadened my perspective and introduced me to innovative approaches being used in other countries. Technology companies began consulting with me on accessibility issues, recognizing that their products and services often excluded larger users. I helped design guidelines for creating apps and websites that were truly inclusive, ensuring that plus-size individuals could access the same digital resources as everyone else. The expansion of my work required me to develop new skills and knowledge areas. I took courses in nonprofit management, policy analysis, and media relations. At an age when many people are slowing down, I was learning and growing in ways that kept me energized and engaged. The intellectual stimulation of my advocacy work was as rewarding as its social impact. The success of my advocacy work inevitably attracted opposition from individuals and organizations who felt threatened by the changes I was promoting. The most significant challenge came when a group of physicians and dietitians organized to oppose the healthcare bias training I had developed, claiming that it promoted unhealthy lifestyles and interfered with medical practice. This opposition was coordinated and well-funded, with supporters launching a campaign to discredit my work and undermine the policies I had helped implement. They questioned my qualifications to speak on health issues and suggested that my advocacy was encouraging people to ignore medical advice. The personal attacks were cruel and designed to shame me back into silence. Initially, these attacks shook my confidence and made me question whether I was overstepping my bounds. The old voices of self-doubt returned, whispering that perhaps I was indeed just a fat old woman who should stay in her place. The opposition's strategy of personalizing the attacks rather than addressing the substance of my arguments was emotionally devastating. However, the support I received from the community I had built was overwhelming. Medical professionals who had implemented my training programs spoke out in defense of their effectiveness. Patients shared stories of improved healthcare experiences after their providers had participated in bias training. Academic researchers published studies supporting the principles underlying my advocacy work. The legal challenge to the city's expanded anti-discrimination ordinance was particularly stressful. Opponents argued that protecting people from weight-based discrimination would create an undue burden on businesses and healthcare providers. The court case required extensive documentation of discrimination patterns and expert testimony about the effectiveness of civil rights protections. I had to learn to navigate the legal system, working closely with civil rights attorneys who were as committed to the cause as I was. The process was time-consuming and emotionally draining, but it also taught me valuable lessons about perseverance and the importance of building strong legal foundations for advocacy work. The media campaign against my work included attempts to discredit my personal story and suggest that I was motivated by financial gain rather than genuine concern for civil rights. Dealing with public scrutiny and personal attacks required developing a thick skin and learning to focus on the substance of my work rather than the noise surrounding it. One of the most difficult obstacles was the realization that some of the healthcare providers and organizations I had worked with were backing away from their commitments under pressure from the opposition campaign. Seeing progress reversed because of political pressure was disheartening and forced me to develop strategies for maintaining momentum even when institutional support wavered. The financial costs of defending my work and the policies it had influenced were significant. Legal fees, expert witnesses, and media consultants strained both my personal resources and those of the organizations supporting the advocacy efforts. I had to learn fundraising skills and build relationships with donors who shared my commitment to civil rights. The stress of these major challenges took a toll on my health and well-being. I experienced anxiety and insomnia as I worried about the potential reversal of hard-won progress. Learning to manage stress while continuing effective advocacy required developing better self-care practices and relying more heavily on my support network. Do you see how a plus-size woman with determination can change not just her life, but other people's lives? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for more stories like this. The breakthrough came 18 months after the opposition campaign began, when a major medical journal published a comprehensive study on weight bias in healthcare that vindicated everything I had been advocating for. The research, conducted by a team of respected physicians and public health experts, demonstrated that discrimination against plus-size patients led to delayed diagnoses, inadequate care, and worse health outcomes across all demographic groups. The study specifically cited my healthcare training program as an example of effective intervention, noting that medical providers who had participated showed significantly reduced bias in their treatment recommendations and communication with larger patients. The academic validation of my work neutralized many of the opposition's arguments and provided scientific backing for the policies I had helped implement. The legal victory came shortly afterward when the state Supreme Court upheld the city's expanded anti-discrimination ordinance, ruling that protection from weight-based discrimination was a legitimate civil rights issue. The court's decision referenced the mounting evidence of systematic discrimination and the effectiveness of legal protections in addressing it. This legal precedent opened the door for similar legislation in other jurisdictions. Public opinion began shifting as more stories emerged of individuals who had benefited from the changes my advocacy had created. A particularly powerful moment came when Dr. Sarah Martinez, the chief of medicine at a major hospital, publicly apologized for the medical profession's history of weight bias and announced new policies requiring bias training for all staff. Members, the nutritionist who had sparked my advocacy journey, reached out to me through an intermediary, requesting a private meeting. When we sat down together in a quiet coffee shop, she was visibly emotional as she apologized for her behavior and the harm it had caused. She told me that my advocacy work had forced her to confront her own biases and that she had completely changed her approach to patient care as a result. Her apology was accompanied by a request that surprised me. She wanted to work with me to develop training materials that could help other nutrition professionals provide more respectful and effective care to plus-size clients. The woman who had once called me a lazy, fat old woman was now asking to become an ally in fighting the very discrimination she had once embodied. This collaboration became one of the most powerful examples of the transformative potential of advocacy work. Together, we created a comprehensive training program for nutrition professionals that addressed both the scientific complexity of weight and health relationships and the importance of respectful client interaction. The program was eventually adopted by the National Association of Dietitians and Nutritionists. The media coverage of our collaboration was extensive and largely positive, focusing on the possibility of redemption and change rather than blame and conflict. The story of the nutritionist's transformation became a powerful symbol of how education and advocacy could create meaningful change in individuals and institutions. Corporate partnerships began emerging as businesses recognized the economic benefits of size inclusivity. Major retailers, airlines, and healthcare systems reached out to me for guidance on improving their services for plus-size customers. These partnerships provided both financial support for my advocacy work and practical venues for implementing policy changes. The opposition campaign, that had once seemed so threatening, began to lose momentum as evidence mounted in favor of the changes I was advocating. Former opponents began quietly implementing bias training and inclusive policies, recognizing that the tide of public opinion had shifted. Some even reached out to me directly for guidance on how to transition to more inclusive practices. 5 years after walking out of that nutritionist office in humiliation, I found myself standing at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a packed auditorium at the National Institutes of Health. I had been invited to deliver the keynote address at a conference on eliminating bias in medical research and practice. Speaking to an audience of physicians, researchers, and policymakers from around the world. The invitation itself was remarkable. But what made the moment truly extraordinary was the content of my presentation. I was announcing the launch of a national initiative to implement bias training in medical schools and healthcare systems across the country. Funded by a coalition of medical associations, government agencies, and private foundations. The program I had developed in response to my own discriminatory treatment was becoming a national standard for medical education. The book I had written about my advocacy journey had become a bestseller, reaching audiences far beyond the size acceptance community. Reader reviews consistently mentioned how the book had changed their understanding of discrimination and inspired them to become advocates in their own communities. Speaking requests were coming in from universities, professional associations, and community organizations across the country. My testimony before Congress had contributed to the passage of the Healthcare Equality Act, which included specific provisions addressing weight-based discrimination in medical settings. The legislation required healthcare providers receiving federal funding to implement bias training and maintain non-discrimination policies that included weight and appearance-based protections. The research I had participated in had generated dozens of peer-reviewed publications demonstrating the prevalence and impact of weight bias in healthcare. This body of evidence was being used by advocates in other countries to advance similar policy changes internationally. My individual story had become part of a global movement for healthcare equity. The National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance had grown significantly during my tenure on the board, with membership tripling and chapters forming in communities that had never had organized size acceptance advocacy. The organization had evolved from a support group into a powerful civil rights organization capable of influencing national policy discussions. Corporate consulting had become a thriving business, with major companies paying substantial fees for my expertise in size inclusivity. I had helped redesign airline seating policies, influenced clothing retailer marketing strategies, and advised technology companies on accessibility features. The economic argument for size inclusion had proven as powerful as the moral argument for civil rights. The international scope of my work had expanded to include partnerships with advocates and researchers in 15 different countries. I had spoken at the World Health Organization about the global implications of weight bias and had consulted with national health systems on implementing inclusive care policies university. Partnerships had led to the establishment of an endowed chair in size. Studies at a major research institution, with my advocacy work serving as the foundation for an interdisciplinary program examining weight, health, and discrimination from multiple academic perspectives. Graduate students were conducting research that built on the groundwork I had laid. The documentary featuring my story had won several awards and had been translated into multiple languages for international distribution. The film had sparked conversations about discrimination and civil rights in communities around the world, demonstrating the universal relevance of the issues I had been addressing. Awards and recognition had come from sources I could never have imagined: civil rights organizations, medical associations, business groups, and academic institutions. But the recognition that meant the most came from the hundreds of individuals who had written to tell me how my advocacy work had changed their lives and given them the courage to demand better treatment. The transformation in how I was perceived and treated in professional settings was dramatic and deeply satisfying. Where I had once been dismissed or ignored, I was now sought out for my expertise and treated with the respect that should have been afforded to me all along. Medical conferences that had once excluded discussions of weight bias were now featuring entire sessions on the topic, often with me as a featured speaker. The American Medical Association invited me to serve on a task force developing guidelines for respectful patient care, acknowledging that my lived experience and advocacy work provided essential perspectives that had been missing from medical policy development. Sitting at that conference table with some of the most respected physicians in the country Being asked for my input on national healthcare policies was a remarkable validation of the journey I had undertaken. Media coverage of my work had evolved from sensationalized human interest stories to serious examinations of civil rights and healthcare policy. Major news outlets regularly contacted me for comment on issues related to weight discrimination, and my op-eds on healthcare equity were being published in prestigious newspapers and magazines. The academic recognition was particularly meaningful given my background in education. Universities were inviting me to speak not just about advocacy, but about the research methodologies and policy analysis that had strengthened my work. Several institutions had offered me honorary doctorates, recognizing my contributions to civil rights and public health. International recognition came when the United Nations invited me to participate in a global conference on discrimination and human rights. Speaking to representatives from nearly 200 countries about the need to address weight-based discrimination was both humbling and empowering. The issues I had begun addressing in my local community were now part of international human rights discussions. The impact on healthcare practices was measurable and significant. Studies showed that medical schools implementing my bias training were producing graduates who demonstrated significantly less weight bias in their patient interactions. Healthcare systems using my protocols reported improved patient satisfaction scores and better health outcomes for plus-size patients. Policy changes had spread far beyond my original advocacy targets. Over 30 cities had expanded their anti-discrimination ordinances to include weight-based protections, and several states were considering similar legislation. The legal precedents established through my advocacy work were being cited in civil rights cases across the country. The business impact was equally significant. Companies that had implemented size-inclusive policies reported increased customer satisfaction, expanded market reach, and improved employee retention. The economic case for inclusion had become so compelling that businesses were proactively seeking guidance on inclusive practices rather than waiting for complaints or legal challenges. Community organizations had adopted my advocacy model, adapting it to address other forms of discrimination and social justice issues. The strategies I had developed for building coalitions, educating stakeholders, and creating policy change were being used by advocates working on disability rights, LGBTQ+ issues, and racial justice. The ripple effects of my work were visible in popular culture as well. Television shows and movies were beginning to feature plus-size characters in roles that weren't defined by their weight, and advertising campaigns increasingly included diverse body types. While these changes were the result of many advocates' efforts, I was proud to have contributed to the cultural shift. Personal recognition came in forms that were both formal and informal. The key to the city presented by Chicago's mayor was displayed proudly in my living room. But equally meaningful were the hundreds of personal letters from individuals whose lives had been changed by my advocacy work. Standing in my living room, 7 years after that devastating nutritionist appointment, I looked at the woman reflected in the mirror and marveled at the transformation that had taken place. Physically, I was still a plus-size woman in her late 60s, but everything else about me had changed fundamentally. The posture was different, shoulders back, head held high, eyes meeting the world with confidence rather than avoiding it in shame. The voice that emerged when I spoke was authoritative and clear, seasoned by years of public speaking and policy advocacy. Where I had once apologized for taking up space, I now commanded rooms filled with influential decision-makers. The timid woman who had accepted discriminatory treatment as inevitable had been replaced by someone who expected respect and was willing to fight for systemic change. My daily life reflected this internal transformation. The morning routine that had once been marked by anxiety about potential discrimination was now energized by anticipation of the day's advocacy opportunities. Phone calls from reporters, emails from potential consulting clients, and invitations to speak at conferences filled my calendar with purpose and meaning. The house that had once felt like a refuge from a hostile world had become a headquarters for social change. My dining room table was covered with policy documents, research studies, and correspondence from advocates around the world. The guest bedroom had been converted into an office where I wrote articles, prepared presentations, and managed the business aspects of my advocacy work. Relationships had been transformed as well. Family members who had once worried about my making trouble now proudly introduced me as a civil rights advocate. Friends regularly sought my advice on handling discriminatory treatment in their own lives. The community that had once seen me as a quiet, retired teacher now recognized me as a powerful voice for justice. The financial transformation was significant, but not the primary focus of my work. Consulting fees, speaking honoraria, and book royalties had provided financial security that complemented my teacher's pension. More importantly, the income validated my expertise and allowed me to pursue advocacy work without financial stress. Health improvements had come, not from weight loss, but from the reduced stress of living authentically and the increased activity that came with my advocacy work. Blood pressure readings were better, joint pain was more manageable, and energy levels were higher than they had been in years. The health benefits of refusing to accept discrimination were measurable and significant. The intellectual growth that had accompanied my advocacy work was remarkable. I had become an expert in civil rights law, healthcare policy, business practices, and social change methodology. The teacher in me was thrilled by the continuous learning that advocacy work required. At an age when many people's worlds were contracting, mine was expanding exponentially. Travel had become a regular part of my life, as speaking engagements and consulting opportunities took me to cities and countries I had never expected to visit. The woman who had once avoided air travel because of discriminatory treatment was now a frequent flyer whose expertise was sought by organizations around the world. The sense of purpose that drove my daily activities was profound and sustaining. Every policy change, every individual transformation, every institutional reform validated the decision to transform personal pain into public advocacy. The work was challenging and sometimes frustrating, but it was deeply meaningful in ways that my previous life, while satisfying, had never been. If you also believe in the transformative power of plus-size women, hit the like button and comment on how this story inspired you. As I sit here today, writing these words at the age of 69, I want to speak directly to every plus-size woman who might be watching this video and feeling trapped by society's expectations and limitations. 7 years ago, I was where many of you might be right now, accepting discriminatory treatment as normal, believing that my size made me less deserving of respect, and allowing other people's prejudices to define my worth and possibilities. The transformation I experienced didn't happen overnight, and it didn't require changing my body to meet anyone else's standards. It required changing my mind about what I deserved and what I was capable of achieving. It required recognizing that the problem wasn't my size. It was a system of discrimination that needed to be challenged by people brave enough to refuse to accept it. Every plus-size woman has within her the power to create change, whether in her own life or in the broader community. The skills you've developed navigating a world that wasn't designed for you, resilience, empathy, problem-solving, and strength, are exactly the skills needed to become an effective advocate for yourself and others. Your experiences with discrimination, painful as they may have been, have given you expertise that can't be learned from books or training programs. You understand the impact of prejudice because you've lived it. You know what changes are needed because you've experienced their absence. Your voice and your perspective are essential to creating a more just and inclusive world. The journey from accepting discrimination to fighting it isn't easy, but it's possible and it's powerful. Start small. Challenge one instance of unfair treatment. Support one other woman facing similar struggles, or educate one person about the reality of size discrimination. Every action, no matter how modest it might seem, contributes to a larger movement for change. Remember that your worth is not determined by your dress size, your weight, or anyone else's opinion of your appearance. You are valuable because you are human, because you have contributions to make, and because you deserve the same respect and dignity afforded to every other person. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The world needs your voice, your ideas, and your advocacy. There are policies that need to be changed, institutions that need to be reformed, and minds that need to be opened. The work is far from finished, And every plus-size woman who refuses to accept discriminatory treatment moves us closer to a society that truly values all people. To the young plus-size women watching this, know that you don't have to wait until you're older to demand better treatment. Start now, start today, start with the next person who treats you as less than you are. Your generation has tools and opportunities that previous generations didn't have. Use them. To my fellow women of my generation, remember that it's never too late to transform your life and your community. The wisdom and experience you've gained over the years, combined with the freedom that often comes with age, make you powerful advocates for change. Don't underestimate what you can accomplish. The nutritionist who called me a lazy, fat old woman thought she was putting me in my place. Instead, she awakened a force for justice that has touched thousands of lives and changed countless policies and practices. Sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest opportunities for growth and service. I am proud to be a fat woman. I am proud to be an old woman. I am proud to be a woman who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. I am proud of every plus-size woman who has found the courage to demand better, to speak up, to fight back, and to create change. The world is slowly becoming more accepting, more inclusive, and more just because of the work that we do together. But there's still so much more to accomplish. I hope my story inspires you to write your own story of transformation, advocacy, and empowerment. The world is waiting for your voice. If this empowerment story touched your soul, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, share with someone special, and write in the comments which city and country you're watching from.